Hi, and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history, and by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. Today, we're going to talk about the Peasants Revolt of 1381. Usually, it's just me, but today I have my friend Rob here. Hi, Rob.
Hi, Tina.
Are you excited to talk about peasants? 14th century peasants?
Yeah.
They were hardcore.
Apparently.
So, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 is the only time the Tower of London was sacked. And it was sacked by a bunch of farmers. But also, that's an oversimplification. That's not all the story. But it is pretty impressive that farmers sacked the Tower of London. They're the only... Armies can't do it.
Yeah, it's a formidable place.
Yeah. So first we have to establish a couple of things. Most people were considered peasants. So these aren't necessarily poor people.
Oh.
A huge portion of the population was considered peasants, and you could be a wealthy, a privileged peasant.
Oh, so just like common folk.
Yes. Yes. And peasants covered such a wide range, but the main dividing line was between freemen and serfs. If you were a free peasant, you could own land and buy and sell things and start a little business if you want. But the serfs, they couldn't do that.
Oh. They weren't slaves. But
They weren't slaves, but they were. It was close. I mean, it would be, if you were poor and you were starving to death and you needed money or assistance of some kind, you could basically sell yourself to a noble for a term of time in exchange for an amount of money. So you would get paid, but then you're owned by them for 7 years. You're tied to their land. You can't just go get another job.
Right. This is an indentured servitude. That's right. Okay.
Yeah. So they were tied to the land and to a specific lord. And you couldn't just decide to move. You couldn't think, oh, there's better jobs in France, I'm going to go there. Nothing. No. You owed them your entire life. And a lot of things contributed to this revolt. About 50 years before this, there was the Great Famine in Europe. So they were only 50 years outside of the Great Famine, which lasted like 3 years. And a quarter of England died in the Great Famine. It affected most of Western and Northern Europe. Like Spain was okay, but like all the Scandinavian countries, England, France, Germany, all affected by the Great Famine.
I see.
They had multiple wet summers in a row. And so the first summer that was super wet, the wheat didn't ripen. The second summer, it was too wet to even plow the field and plant. And by the third summer, things were starting to look up, but by that point, they'd eaten all their seeds and all their plow animals.
Oh.
So it wasn't an easy bounce back. So that was 50 years ago. So that was like these people's grandparents or great-grandparents, because sometimes they had kids pretty young.
Yeah.
And 25% of the population was lost in this famine. And people starved all over Europe. It took about a decade for them to get back to pre-famine food levels.
Oh, wow.
Because they really did eat, like, most of their seeds. And like, nobody had plow horses anymore because they had to eat them or starve to death. So then, about 30 years after the Great Famine was the pretty major plague years, the bubonic plague.
Oh, wow.
That happened just like 30 years after the Great Famine.
Okay, they're just hitting by one thing after another, right?
So they finally recovered from the Great Famine and the loss of 25% of the population, and then the plague wiped out a third of Europe.
Wow.
So they had a lot less people than they had 60 years ago.
Right.
And then, about 30 years after that whole plague thing, so they're just recovering from that and things are starting to feel normal again, it was 1381. So that's where we are now.
Okay.
Like, there's a lot of generational trauma going on between the starvation and the plague, and now this generation's like, this world's going to hell. Because so many people have died of the plague, laborers could now charge more because there weren't as many, most of the people were peasants.
Right.
So they could charge way more for their work. And so nobles and royals started to pay more for good help. Like, you had to be rich to afford good help at this point because the peasants were charging a lot more. And the nobles and royals thought that was a shit deal. So they enacted emergency legislation to cap peasants' salaries.
Oh.
Like, stop asking for so much money, peasants. You're supposed to be a poor. Like, go be a
Right.
poor. And, like, if the poors had money, then how would you recognize them as a poor? You can't tell that you're better than everyone if the poors can afford all the same things that you have.
Right.
And that was a problem for the nobles. They were like, no, we have to be able to recognize. How do we know who to hire if they're not in rags?
Yes.
So the Ordinance of Labors was passed right around the time that the plague was near its peak. So when there was a lot of dead people. And the ordinance required several things, including, but not limited to, everyone under 60 must work.
Wow.
Like if you're just a common person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not allowed to stop working until you're 60. Employers were not allowed to hire excess workers. You couldn't hire backup workers just in case one of your workers died of the plague. Employers may not pay and workers may not receive wages higher than pre-plague levels. So nobody's getting a raise.
Right.
It's illegal to offer a raise. It's illegal to accept a raise. Food must be priced reasonably with no excess profit. And no one, under pain of imprisonment, was to give anything to able-bodied beggars under the color of pity or alms. So you can't just be like, I'm donating to the
Right.
poor. If it's an able-bodied poor,
Right. Then
you can't give
just-
them money. You will
Right.
go to jail for giving them money if they look like they could
Wow.
hold down a job and they're under 60. And you can't just say it's, alms, like alms for the poor. Like you're not just trying to buy your way into heaven. You're
Right.
enabling bad behavior of an able-bodied peasant. So to some degree, the workers were like, no, we don't agree. And you can't, like, if we all stick together, who's going to do your shit, right?
Right.
Like, there's more of us than there is
Yeah,
of you.
like labor versus.
Yeah, so the laws kept being piled on and piled on and piled on, and the people kept, like, fighting back. Like, no, this is unacceptable. Like, you need us to do your work. And we're like 80% of the population, so what are you going to do? And for about a century, at least peasants in England did actually fairly well financially because there was less of them, and so they got more money. And things started to get a little, and it was never even. Like, there was definitely a wage gap, but it got closer. The gap got smaller. So then some of the poor people were not poor anymore, and they could start to afford nice fabric and clothing.
Oh.
So they could dress like rich people,
Right. Right.
some of them, because they were getting money. And, like, maybe they saved up for a whole year and got, like, one really rad dress.
Right.
But the nobles did not like that. So they made another law. And it is the 1363 statute concerning diet and apparel.
Oh wow.
And they were basically like, if you're supposed to be a peasant, you can't wear nice clothes and you can't eat nice food. Like, this is reserved for the
Right.
The
you gotta stay in your
regal
place.
people. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, we don't care if you can afford it.
Right.
Like, dress like a poor so we can recognize you. And it reminds me of The Handmaid's Tale. Like, they all have their different outfits for,
Yeah.
like, what level they are.
Yeah. You gotta stay in your lane.
Mm-hmm. Like, you can't just wear, like, a dress of a wife if you're not a wife. That'll get you put in jail or killed or something.
Right.
So, by 1381, the 100 Years' War was 45 years in. So, they'd been at war for 45 years. So, only people nearing the age of, say, 50, which wasn't a lot of people because times had been bad,
Right.
could even remember a time when there wasn't war, and they would have been small children. So they're 45 years into the 100 Years' War, which lasted like 116 years or something, so they're not even halfway done. But they don't know that yet. They just know they're 45 years into a war, and they're like, this is bullshit. The king who started the war was no longer alive. His grandson was the king,
Right.
and they were still fighting the war. So, and also, the war was expensive. Really expensive. And the peasants were having to pay for a lot of it. So, just before the old king died, because he had recently died, his grandson is a child, he's the new king, but this old king who started the long war recently died. But right before he died, he enacted a wildly unpopular poll tax to help him pay for this war. And basically, he would set an amount and say, if you live here, if you are English, you pay this amount. And the amount kept going up, but it was also just a flat amount. So it didn't matter if you were barely making it, like barely feeding your children, or if you were like the richest person in England.
Right.
Each person had to pay the same amount.
Right.
So it was more disabling for some than others. Because some people, it was like nothing. But some people, it was like,
it's a
we're not going to eat if
very
we pay this.
regressive tax.
Yeah. And they kept going up and up and up. Because they're like, oh, this makes it easy to pay for the war. And poll taxes were enacted that every person over the age of 16, so regardless of who you are, if you're just a person who is at least 16, even if you live with your parents, just like you probably didn't back then at 16, but everyone over the age of 16 was required to pay a flat amount that was no problem for the wealthy, hard but doable for the middle class, and completely debilitating for the bottom, like 50% of the population. So like half the population was like, I can't pay that. That's way too much money. I don't have that money.
All right.
So what I'm saying is they were reaching a boiling point. People were getting slowly more and more agitated to the point where they felt like they didn't really have anything to lose because they can't afford to pay the taxes anymore. And nearly every adult male had some military training and experience because they'd been at war for 45 years. So, like, almost everyone had military training.
Right.
Because they needed soldiers, yeah. And on top of that, they are the soldiers that survived the war, so they probably had some skill at this kind of thing. And games were illegal. So you couldn't just go out and play football if you wanted to, like, let off some steam or something.
Right.
Games were illegal because they were seen as a waste of time. Like, if the peasants are playing games, they have time to work for free.
Right.
So, but you could train for the military because they wanted people to do that because they needed soldiers, right? So that's, like, the closest thing to a game. Like, you could have, like, an archery tournament or, like, it's game adjacent. It's something to do.
Right.
So they were doing it all the time.
Yeah, it's also military skills.
Mm-hmm. And it wasn't called the Peasants Revolt at the time. That's like a name we give to it now.
Right.
But at the time, it wasn't known as that. At the time, it was called the Insurrection of Wat Tyler.
Oh.
Which is a much radder nickname. I don't know why we changed it to the Peasants Revolt.
Is Wat Tyler a person? Or?
He is a person.
Oh, okay.
This is the Insurrection of Wat Tyler.
Oh, yeah.
Are you fascinated? You want to know about Wat Tyler?
Sure.
So the last straw was that a royal official named John Brampton, who attempted to collect unpaid taxes in Brentwood, which is in Essex, England. Mm-hmm. And people rose up. They were like, no, fuck off. We've paid enough taxes. We're not paying anymore. And it got a little violent. They were like, this man had to, like, hightail it out of there.
Right.
Because the peasants were like, I'm going to stab you with this pitchfork or shoot you with my gun if you try to take more money. Like, we're trying to not die of starvation. So a man named Wat Tyler led a huge group of people to London. They were, like, on their peaceful protest. They were marching on London to be like, no more taxes. And, like, also, these stupid taxes are paying for a stupid war that we don't even want to be in. Like, 45 years.
Right.
That's crazy. So the king's mother, Joan, the fair maid of Kent, she almost got caught up by the rebels. She did actually get, like, she ran into the rebels. She was fleeing. They caught up to her. So, but they didn't kill her. She somehow managed to talk her way out of it. Now, she is known as being the most beautiful woman in England at the time.
Right.
And also known as being very charming.
Yeah, okay.
Apparently, they viciously mocked her before setting her free.
Oh, how rude.
I know. This is the time of chivalry. Can't just be mocking the mother of the king of England, you know? Mm. So, but I talked about all that in her episode. She has her own episode where I talk about the whole she's fleeing, the peasants catch her, that whole thing. So when the peasants get to London, they started destroying buildings, burning some of them to the ground.
Oh, okay.
Because no one would know that they were supposed to be the poors if all the records about who was and was not a poor was destroyed.
Oh, right. Oh.
And the church had all those records.
Oh, very Tyler Durden of them.
Yeah. So they literally just went and burned anywhere with a record. They were like, can't find me if you don't have paperwork saying that I'm a peasant.
All right.
So they were just burning stuff. They went all around London, just burning buildings to the ground. And people were killed all over the city because in addition to burning buildings, they were also looking for the people who were clearly definable as being the wealthy because they were the only ones allowed to wear the fancy clothes. So if you had a good outfit on, you better hide because they did not give a fuck. They were like, oh, look, it's a fancy-ass person in a fancy-ass clothes that I'm not allowed to legally wear. The recognition works both ways.
Yes.
And there was a code word, like a code question with the right answer. Like if you meet someone in the forest, okay, they're going to ask you, with who hold you? That's what they're going to ask.
All right.
And the correct answer that you need to give is, with King Richard and the true commons. Because they did support the teenage king.
Mm-hmm.
They just thought he was surrounded by a bunch of assholes.
Ah.
So, like, we stand with the king and, like, the good people.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't answer that, then you're probably not one of them and
Ouch. Okay.
dead in the forest. So, if anyone ever asks you, with who hold you, the correct answer is, with King Richard and the true commons.
Okay,
Don't forget it.
Remember that, yes.
But I like that they had, like, a secret question and a secret.
Yeah.
It's very spy of them.
Yeah.
And so the nobility, a lot of them, the ones that managed to avoid this angry group of people, they held up in the tower. The ones that made it to the tower.
Right.
The Queen Mother, who was viciously mocked,
Right.
she made it to the tower.
Ah.
The king was in the tower.
Right. Well, that's where you'd hide.
Yeah, that's where they're hiding. They're like, shoot, when they're burning London to the ground, we'll stay in this tower and hope they go away. And the nobility was basically in a state of shock. They were like, holy shit, what do we do? Like, they didn't have any ideas, like, how to figure, like, make this better again. This was not something they thought they would have to deal with. And they decided that the king is a 14-year-old child at this point. King Richard II.
Right.
He's 14. They decided the king should go out and parlay with the peasants. Like, they seem to like you.
Right.
They say they stand with you and the good people, so why don't we just send you out there to talk to the peasants? And the king's like, I guess so, I'm king. And he's also 14, and a bunch of adult men are telling him he needs to go fix this because he's the king. So the king went out to meet with the rebel leaders. The problem is that the king is the only one they liked. So once he left the tower,
Right.
that was just a whole building full of people they hated.
Yeah.
The king's the only one they cared
So
about.
they gave up their only hostage, really.
Yeah. And that is when the Tower of London got sacked, while the king was out parlaying with the peasants. Other peasants came and sacked the tower.
Right.
For weapons, like a lot of them had weapons,
Right.
but some of them didn't. And so they took the thing that they would use to thresh the wheat back then.
Oh, right.
And it's like a big long stick with a chain and then a big metal ball at the end.
Oh.
And so they just like added a bunch of spikes.
Oh.
And kind of invented that shit with their wheat threshers. They like added spikes and they're like, this could thrash a person.
Yeah, it's like a flail.
Made their own homemade DIY flails.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, so they weren't just like farmers with pitchforks. They were like...
Yeah, they had some actual...
Scary, yeah. I was listening, I don't remember, I was listening to a documentary at one point, and they were saying that it kind of like, it's a crude metaphor, but they imagine it would be like just a random person with like baseball bats with nails in them or something. Like, it's just like a homemade, dangerous weapon. So that is what they sacked the Tower of London. I mean, some of them had guns, some of them had weapons.
Right.
And probably a lot of them did have pitchforks and stuff, but
Right.
they weren't just messing around. They sacked the Tower of London with homemade flails. What are they called?
I think sticks with the balls at the end of a chain. I think those are flails.
Yeah, I think so too. And anyone nobility adjacent was killed on sight. So, like, if you were a lady's maid to a noble person, you might be killed. And they got to the rooms of the Queen Mother, where they again viciously mocked her.
Oh, wow.
I don't know exactly what they said, but I think there was like sexual innuendos. Like they were like, hey, Queen, how about you give me a kiss? Like stuff like that. But it was very offensive at the time. She was like, how dare you? Like,
very inappropriate.
You were not wearing nice clothes. I am the Queen Mother. You can't say that. So I don't have like exact transcript of what they said, but it was basically like that. And it's often described as vicious mocking. So she was upset. She felt targeted. And then she got smuggled out dressed as a servant. They dressed her as a poor and snuck her people.
Right.
Like her servants were like, here, dress up like a poor like us. And we'll like, doo-doo-doo, hey, sorry about that. We're poor like you. Yeah. And she got smuggled out. Oh. I must have killed her to put on those clothes. Like, she is part of the rule. I mean, she's not making laws because she's a woman, but she is part of the ruling society who's like, oh, can't wear the same clothes as them.
Oh, giving her choices.
Yeah, she's been viciously mocked twice.
Yes.
So, meanwhile, the king is at the meeting with the peasants.
Right.
The other peasants, the ones who aren't sacking the tower. And he went out and he listened to their demands, and one of their demands was that serfdom be abolished. And he was like, yeah, that sounds fair. It'd be shitty to be a serf.
Yeah.
I agree. I'll abolish serfdom. Because that's what happens when you send a 14... I mean, I think he should have, but also the nobles are probably like, holy shit, like, can't send a 14-year-old king to go make a deal.
Right. I mean, I don't know that he had a whole lot of leverage.
No. But he basically no pushback at all. He was just like, yeah, that sounds fair. I accept your demands. Right. That's reasonable. Let's call it a day. Please stop burning London. And so that's when serfdom was actually, I mean, it was actually abolished. That's when serfdom was abolished in England. When the peasants were like, we hate serfdom. And Richard was like, fair enough. Right. So some of the rebels were appeased. The ones who were like mostly just in it because they hated serfdom. And they were like, okay, they were like, some people were like, that's enough. You don't have to do anything else. But there was a more hardcore group that wanted certain people dead.
Oh.
Certain high-level advisors of the kings.
They wanted
like,
blood.
Yeah, like, they're just going to reverse everything if you don't let us kill them. And King Richard said, no, we're not going to just be killing my friends. They're my advisors.
Right.
They advise, let's just be friends moving forward. We can figure this out. And they were like, no, fuck them. They're out. And so then King Richard met with Wat Tyler because he was there. And this was his insurrection, after all.
Right.
So King Richard demanded Wat Tyler answer because he was one of the fanatical people who hadn't left London and were still burning stuff down. King Richard asked Wat Tyler, like, why won't you leave? Like, I got rid of serfdom.
Right.
Like, you need to answer for that. And Wat Tyler responded. He said something to the king, and while he said it, he angrily gestured at the king. Now, I don't know what he did. I imagine he flipped him off, but I don't think that was a thing then, really, at that time and place.
Not, but something similar.
That vibe, right? So he made an angry gesture, but the mayor of London took offense to it. And he was like, arrest Wat Tyler for being rude to the king, because they could just do that shit then. And Tyler attacked the mayor of London. And the mayor of London stabbed him. And then some really, like, gung-ho squire jumped in and stabbed him a bunch of more times. Like, finished him off.
Right.
Yeah.
So they killed him.
Yeah, the squire just, like, went nuts. Right. And so Wat Tyler was dead. And he was beheaded. And his, like, head was displayed, you know, up on a pike for people to see. Yeah. I mean, how else are they going to know? Right. Don't mess with me. And the rebellion kind of started to fall apart. Like, Wat Tyler really kind of was the guy holding it together. They were like, oh, shit, I don't want to be beheaded.
Right.
Okay, thanks for getting rid of serfdom. Bye.
Right.
And it just kind of disintegrated. And that is the insurrection of Wat Tyler. He died. But serfdom died too.
Yeah, obviously he accomplished something.
He did. And the people that they wanted killed, the high up people that they were like, we demand their death, they were in the tower. So they died anyway, because when the tower got sacked, they got killed.
Oh, okay.
So they really kind of did get mostly what they wanted.
Yeah.
The king didn't have them executed. He had Wat Tyler. Well, I guess he didn't have him executed. He was killed and then they beheaded him after the fact, but... Well, that is the Peasants Revolt of 1381. I thought it was interesting that they DIY'd their own weapons. Like, they got a little, like, Pinterest with their weapon ideas.
People can be very resourceful.
Yeah. They were like, well, we won't have enough money to buy any kind of wheat to thresh, so might as well turn our wheat threshers into weapons. And it turns out if you add spikes to your wheat threshers, although I would argue even without the spikes, it'd do some pretty major damage. You have a stick with a chain with a metal ball on the end.
Yeah, that would hurt.
Yeah. There'd be a lot of TBIs all around London. Thank you for recording the Peasants Revolt with me.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Will be remembered.
Thanks for listening.